Welcome to Columbus Report on Waycross Community Media. I'm Government Programming Coordinator Dana Gagnon, and we have in our studio today Ohio Senator Bill Blessing. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I really appreciate the time you take to come down here and make sure that we know what's happening in Columbus. There's a lot that's happening up there that affects our everyday life, and it's happening up there. We don't always see what's going on in committees and what's getting introduced and how that will affect us here. So I appreciate your help keeping us connected to that.
Absolutely. Hopefully I'll be a regular fixture going forward.
Yes, and you've always been really helpful connecting to us at Waycross, and I really appreciate that. It's of course my whole mission to connect the local community to what's going on in their government. And it's hard sometimes to see the things that are happening. We'll hear about one or two topics, maybe if we catch them on the news, and we'll get about this much. We won't get really an analysis of it. And you've always been really good to bring us a bigger picture when it comes to each one of these bills and the things that get introduced. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So there were a few main things that you were thinking it would be a good idea to talk about. The first one was your cash bill, SB 242.
That's right. Yeah, so this is sort of an interesting bill in that it comes from New Jersey. It was a Democratic piece of legislation, although I will point out that now some Tennessee legislators are looking at it on the Republican side of the aisle, because it's one of those things that's, I think it crosses party lines. But I can see where some in the business community would have reservations in supporting it. But for the viewers and for what it is, the bill simply requires retail establishments, so this is face-to-face, not anything online, obviously, they are required to accept cash as a payment. Now, obviously, you can still use credit card, whatever else, but they have to accept cash. The penalty for not accepting cash is it's seen as a deceptive act or practice under the Consumer Sales Practices Act, and the AG could file suit, or there's actually a private right of action in the legislation. So an individual could then file suit against the business for damages as well as non-economic damages up to $5,000. Now, pretty simple in concept, and most people might ask, well, I could go into a lot of places and pay cash. That's not a problem now. Well, it's moving towards a cashless society, and it seems, okay, that's nice, that's convenient, that's the way of the future, but there's also a lot of issues tied into that that kind of are left unspoken. The first and foremost is when you pay cash, you and the merchant are the only two people in this transaction. There's no third party. However, when you use a credit card, there's a tech company, a bank, so on and so forth up the stack that will be seeing this or will be involved in the transaction. It's really not that much of a leap to see in the future, for political reasons, transactions being shut down for political issues, and that is an enormous red flag. Not to mention, a lot of folks have issues from a privacy standpoint. They don't like seeing, they don't like a third party seeing what they're buying. Now, is that going to be an issue for everybody? No, of course not. But the difference is, again, if you're looking to the future, if you're looking at some very technocratic tendencies, really not just in the United States, but throughout the world, it's really not that much of a leap to see governments saying, hey, we're looking at what you're purchasing via your credit card and acting accordingly. A good example that I use and could foresee happening is, suppose you're older, suppose you have high blood pressure, you're a little bit overweight, and you enjoy going to Wendy's, for example, and you like getting fast food. I could easily see insurance companies, and the federal government saying, well, This guy could be potentially costing us a fortune. Should he really be getting Wendy's at his weight and in his health condition? No, I don't think so. And he could find himself having the credit card denied. Now, that would obviously create an uproar, but again, these sorts of things in a cashless society could occur. There's also the issue of folks that are typically cash, just cash users. Senior citizens are typically, more likely to use cash. It's, it could be a generational thing. I mean, cell phones have only been, smartphones, I guess, have only been around for a decade and change. So they're more comfortable using that. Being forced to fumble around with this app and whatever to pay for, you name it, isn't exactly going to be appealing. At the same time, low-income folks, folks that have trouble getting banked, are obviously more likely to use cash. And one thing that's probably of some interest to Hamilton County in general are immigrants. What do you do if you're an immigrant and, like others, if you can't be banked, you're running in cash? Now, we could get into the issues of immigration and what to do. That's a whole federal issue. But if folks are here and they're shut out of the economy, is that a good thing? And the answer is emphatically no.
That really does create another class of people that don't have access if that happens. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that this is coming from different sides of the aisle in different states, different parts of the country where you don't normally see the same sort of things being introduced, maybe in New Jersey and Tennessee.
Fair point.
and being from New England, and it's not normally something that I see the same sorts of things. So it's interesting that there are so many concerns about this, but it makes sense because there's concerns over here about people who they just want privacy. They just don't want to tracked. And then there's concerns over here where, also privacy aside, is it accessible? Does every single person have access to an electronic form of payment? I also think that when there's glitches and anything electronic goes down, we're a little bit frozen if that's the only option we have. Even if it's just to buy, peanut butter and bread. So that strikes me as interesting because when I first saw it and I first looked it up, I thought, okay, it's a bill to ensure that retail merchants still accept cash when you're in person. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but why? What's the impetus behind this? Why is this introduced? So what kind of reception is this getting in Columbus?
So it's interesting you bring that up, and I should mention that you being from New England, the first state to adopt this was Massachusetts.
Okay.
Back in the late 70s. But the reception to this is, the business community hasn't had a chance to weigh in. It's only had 2 hearings in its committee, sponsored testimony, so I get up there and do my pitch, and then you bring in some proponents. But since this is something I felt really strong about, I'm like, I need to get this out there and see who shakes out. And it turns out that 2 organizations came out as proponents, the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center, not exactly conservative constituencies. That having been said, the business community's general gripe with it is, this isn't a problem, which of course you're going to say that. It presumably isn't a problem, although I can think of some examples right now. The Apple Store is one of them, not that I have Apple products, but there is a restaurant or a takeout restaurant in Columbus that's, card only, which one of the staffers sent me. I had never been there, but, it's happening.
Yeah.
So I think the bigger concern is the business community does not like the concept of a private right of action, the ability to be sued, and who can really blame them at that point. But if you're going to do this, you need some form of enforcement mechanism to ensure that it actually is done. Otherwise, it's, toothless.
And I did notice as businesses were starting to open up right after the shutdown, walking around, small businesses, like walking around over the Rhine downtown, and they're all smaller independent business owners down there. Some of them said we're cashless for now. There's germs on cash. We're just going to do card only. You can touch the card. I don't have to touch anything. In an area where there's a whole lot of different options to choose from, if that's not what you brought with you, you can just pick something else.
Right.
I think the fact to make sure that there is still some place that accepts cash is key in communities where there isn't access to a lot of different grocery stores. I know we have food deserts where if you're someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of bank accounts and you only have this one place to buy food, it's really important to know that they will accept whatever it is you have for tender. So I can see this being useful.
I'm glad you mentioned the term tender, because that was something that it even shocked me, because a couple folks had brought up, well, wait a minute, it says, this is legal tender. You should be able to use it anywhere. Well, it's legal tender for all debts, public and private. And it came as a shock to me that, okay, if you have a debt, then you pay, okay, they have to accept cash in that instance. But it does seem that, like in the case of the restaurant, I haven't been to the Apple Store, but I presume this is the case. If you're charged up front, that's not a debt. It's, it sort of gets around the nuance there for cash. So you learn something new every day. I would have thought, when I first started looking into this, the same thing. Like, well, it's a form of payment. You can't, they have to accept it. Apparently not the case.
It says it on the paper. You think it must have to work. How does this relate at all to stories of people that say you can't pay me with thousands of pennies, and people who say, oh, but pennies are legal tender?
No,
how does that connect to that?
So it doesn't connect to the bill per se. They would still be able to prohibit that. I mean, that would. And who can blame them?
Right.
Although last I had heard there was a coin shortage, so good luck trying to get the, gazillion pennies to be able to do that. But that's something that was considered. In addition, the bill does have some carve-outs for things that, given where Ohio is, municipal parking, if you go downtown Cincinnati, it's card payment. You can't put coins in there, at least to my knowledge, you can't. There might be some old legacy ones floating around, but that's grandfathered in. We're not, or at least I'm not, intending to go after, a system that's already in place.
So the idea is not to break things that are already moving forward.
Right.
Because, like you said, parking meters, a lot of places, they don't take coins at all anymore.
Right.
Not that coins got you that much parking anyway,
well,
at the current
true.
parking rates. But just to make sure that in general, things are accessible.
Yes.
Okay.
That's key.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, and I appreciate you bringing that one here because that's not one that I was familiar with. And also why there might be a need for it, and that it's coming from different directions. Mm-hmm. You introduced it. Where did the idea come from that Ohio should be part of that?
Well, I mean, I frankly was annoyed with, where things were going with the concerns over, what could a cashless society mean? Again, you see some very technocratic things going around, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, and looked if this had been done elsewhere, and as it turns out, it has. New Jersey wasn't the only one, as I had said, Massachusetts, Colorado recently did it. I'm missing a state, Rhode Island did it as well. But now Tennessee's considering it. Now, I will concede that these are mostly blue states that are doing it, but I think people are waking up to, what it could mean when there's somebody, third party, inserted into every single transaction, and your transactions aren't necessarily as private as you might like them.
Well, we already know stories of people that have to control the sale of cold medicine, because sadly that can be made into other things. And someone that, you can buy so many boxes of cold medicine, specific kinds, in so much time. But if you needed to buy it for your grandkid or for someone else in your family, well, you're stuck because they've tracked that and they know how much. So I could see that it's not, it seems like, oh no, you're worried about people tracking you. Is that extreme? It's kind of already there, depending on which products we're talking about. So it's not really a stretch.
Right.
But then at the other hand, that there's the accessibility issue. So I can see that this has appeal across the board.
Yes.
Which is interesting. We don't see a lot of those. So that makes this really interesting. So thank you. There are some more that you brought. I want to make sure we leave time.
Yeah.
House Bill 126.
Yes. And I will make this one somewhat easier because it takes some nuance. But what the genesis of this bill, and this one was a piece of legislation very much supported by the business community. In fact, it was a key vote by the Chamber, Ohio Chamber of Commerce, and the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business. So that's your smaller businesses out there. But the crux of the legislation is that it requires school districts to file resolutions if they're going to challenge property valuations. They can only initiate those challenges on property values that have had an increase in value of $500,000, and that increase is also 10% of the value. And the way that they determine that delta is that you can only do this you can only file for tax years the year after a sale was made. And much was made in committee about the concept of an arm's length sale being the best indicator of what a valuation is. Because if you haven't sold your house, you're kind of, at the mercy of what the auditor thinks it is based on surrounding sales. It also prohibits local political subdivisions from appealing the decision of the Board of Revision, if they get to the Board of Revision level, to then go to the Board of Tax Appeals. So I guess I probably should have described the process a little more before I went into that. But one final piece is that it abolishes private pay agreements between the local political subdivision and owners to avoid going to the Board of Revision. So a lot of times, let's say, for example, the school district is going to challenge a commercial property. They start talking, and there's an agreement by the business. All right, look, don't challenge us. We'll pay you directly, and then we'll drop it. And that occurs, and the problem with that is from the state standpoint, our school funding formula is based on what the valuation is of local districts, their ability to raise local revenue, even the income of their residents. Well, if a property value should be higher than it really is because of a private pay agreement, they're sort of double dipping from the standpoint of, well, the state sees you guys as poorer than you really are, so you're going to get more money from us, but you're still getting the money at the same time from the owner. Now, if I haven't confused you enough, let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
What can happen here, and what does happen, is a lot of times local political subdivisions that have a vested interest in higher valuations, it's nothing against them, it's just the way it is, will challenge property values that they feel are too low. Typically, these are commercial properties. They're not going to go after typically, somebody with a $100,000 house. I mean, doesn't make sense to do that. It's bad politics. Well, what they can do then is they can challenge the owner. It goes then to the Board of Revision. Every county has one. So that's your auditor, that's your treasurer, and a county commissioner make up the Board of Revision. They will decide what they think, how this should shake out. Should you go to a new valuation, whatever. Currently, because this, even though I don't know if it's been signed by the governor. We did get it to his desk, so I think he's going to soon. If the owner or the school district doesn't like that decision, they can take it to the Board of Tax Appeals in Columbus, which can then adjudicate, on what the valuation should be. Now, this is big money. I mean, if you have a commercial property that's $50 million in value, your assessed value on that, if it's fair market value, is $50 million. Its assessed value is going to be 35% of that, so $17.5 million, and however many mills you have are going to eat into that. Well, a valuation difference of $10 million could mean a significant amount of money every year to the owner. So that's why these things are contentious. The impetus for this bill was, and I'll use City of Columbus, their public school district for this example. The challenging process was outsourced to a law firm that would then go through there and look at all of these valuations and we're going to challenge this, we're going to challenge this, we're going to challenge this, and made a cottage industry of it.
Okay.
So the idea was, can you strike the right balance here to say, okay, local political subdivisions, if you're going to challenge, it's got to be a pretty egregious example. It's got to be a large delta.
And you say local political subdivisions, just to break that down that's your town government or your school district?
It's so
pretty
it
much.
Is pretty much.
Okay.
But I would say in the vast majority of cases, it is the school district making the challenge because the bulk of your local taxes are from school levies.
Sure.
So again, not to pick on them, but they're actually, they do serve a function from the standpoint of the auditor that, hey, these challenges, they would argue, help from the standpoint of, well,
Sure,
maybe we were wrong.
There's a balance there. There's a check.
Correct.
Because someone with, as you said, a multi-million-dollar property is going to try to get that assessed as low as possible. But from a paying your fair share perspective, that school district or whoever it is that's challenging is saying, no, if this is worth more than that, then that money goes to you guys, and then you send it back to the school district. So you want to make sure. So then that does make sense. Why you don't want all these little things on the side, because now you can't track what the value really is, how much you really do need to send to different school districts.
That's right.
Okay, we're hearing a little bit about this at, of course, Waycross covers school board meetings also. So I did want to get an explanation. How does this work? It affects property taxes, mostly the big ones, though.
That's right. Okay. And I should point out, this, as far as the private pay agreements are concerned, it's not necessarily the school districts. I mean, that to them, it's just a tool that they had. I mean, they're, when that was pitched as this has to occur, I mean, they were fine with it. I mean, they still, obviously, the School Board Association didn't support 126, but that piece of it was less of an issue because it's like, all right, if you're going to ban that, we get it. We understand.
So there's still one avenue for appeal, for challenge, rather.
Yeah. So you can still go to the Board of Revision.
Okay.
But before, if you didn't like the Board of Revision's decision, you could then go to the Board of Tax Appeals, and that is cut off now. And the reason for that is it's not like, this was cut off for no good reason. It was cut off because that's where the costliest litigation was occurring. And of course, if you're hiring a law firm for that, there's a strong incentive to take that to that level.
And I didn't ask you this ahead of time, so I know you don't have notes with you. How many of those, when you saw it go to the next level, how many of those would win that appeal?
Now that I don't actually have the answer to.
Okay.
But it's not even so much the winning or losing of the appeal, it's the threat of the appeal that will make most people freak out and say, we'll settle any which way we can. So if you're going to threaten an appeal, no matter what the Board of Revision decision is, that's enough of a deterrent for people to, okay, we're going to go forward with this. We're going to try to fight a school district or a county commission or whatever. So that's the whole reason why going to the Board of Tax Appeals was cut off. Okay,
so it's to streamline, but not to remove the chance to challenge, but just to streamline it.
Correct. Okay. And you do have that final adjudication then at your Board of Revision, and the complaints were made, well, what what if, you know, you have a county auditor or a treasurer or somebody that feels really strongly that values need to be low? Would that be a problem for the school districts? Well, yeah, it would, but at the same time, these are also elected officials. If somebody is not being fair, the argument was made, elect a new auditor, elect a new treasurer, elect a new, you know, county commission to be on that board of revision.
Well, that's perfect, because that brings me to make sure you're involved and in tune with what's happening in your local government, and you can do that by watching programs on Waycross. Thanks for cueing that. That was not in the plans, but no, that's really the point. That's why we're here doing this,
Yes.
is because to be involved in your local government, I think we forget that. We see what's happening when we think government. Sometimes commercial stations show us what's happening at the national level and presidential level, and you feel very disconnected, and you feel like as a resident and as a voter that you don't have that much influence, but you do have influence on all these kinds of issues. You know, if you're watching things and you're thinking, well, I don't know if organizations and big companies pay their fair share. That's what this is about. So these are the kinds of things that connect right to people's daily questions.
No question.
So I appreciate that. Thank you for that segue. Yeah, is there anything else you want to make sure people know about 126 and help them understand
I
it?
think we've got it.
Yeah.
There's a few articles out there that, you know, whether it's the Cincinnati Enquirer or the various other papers throughout the state that have covered this. If you're interested in learning more, you can read those, or certainly reach out to my office. We'll give you the whole 9 yards on
Excellent.
that.
And I always appreciate that you have more detail and in-depth and just a lot of that specific information. It's not just, here's some generalities, good luck. I do appreciate that a lot. And I want to talk about the housing bill, because you're working on that, and housing is very close to the new Forest Park mayor's goals and missions. So I definitely want to hear more about this.
Yeah, so this is actually not a bill yet, and it's interesting because I think at some point we'll probably discuss House Bill 563, the whole, you know, if you have you're basically precluding local municipalities from litigating, or not litigating, but basically barring Airbnb and short-term rentals. But that's not what my housing bill does. It just conceptually, at least now we're getting back to speaking in generalities, it's sort of along the same line. Well, what my housing bill would do, it's based on Senate Bill 1079 out of California. And what it seeks to do, again in generalities here because we don't have the actual draft, is that it seeks to stop the bulk buying of single-family homes. And it also changes how the foreclosure auction process works, so that before, as soon as somebody did the highest bid, you know, you took possession of the property. Now there's a 45-day waiting time after that, where the owner occupant has the opportunity to say, hey, I can meet that, or a nonprofit or some other land trust can say, hey, I can meet or exceed that, then they can purchase that. And the whole impetus for this legislation, and I'm sure there are a number of viewers, and maybe you even read about it or experienced it yourself, where folks are trying to buy houses and they're finding out from the realtor, hey, congratulations, we're glad you got the lending for this, but oh, by the way, a cash buyer just purchased this home 10% overbid, so sorry about your luck. And you hear about that more and more and more, and that is the effect of private equity and Wall Street getting in there and being able to snap up a lot of these properties and then turn them around to be rentals and, get a yield on it, which, I mean, it's unsurprising that it's gone this way. I mean, the stock market's at, nearly an all-time high, either in the search of yield. This is one avenue for that. Unfortunately, I think it is a disservice to not just my constituents and Ohioans, but citizens of this country generally. Single-family housing is a net good. If you're going to start a family, you want stable housing. You don't want to feel like you have to, break your 401k, borrow money for families and from family and friends, and do everything that you can to compete against what effectively is limitless capital, who will then rent it out. So that is why I am doing that bill. It is a trend that is growing that I find to be deeply disturbing.
I want to catch on, you mentioned bulk buying, and something that I have seen just in this area, and I know it's happening everywhere, that kind of bulk buying where these renters are not someone that's part of the community, that's invested in the community. And I feel like that's important to say, because it's not so much that rentals themselves are a problem. New college graduates usually rent before they buy. Your workforce often rents before they buy.
Yeah.
But I have talked to more friends who have tried to get something solved, or I've recorded more council meetings where someone tried to get something solved in their neighborhood, and the actual owner of the house was a corporation in Georgia.
Sure.
And there was no person to talk to, and they don't care what the yard looks like and what
That's
the
right.
neighborhood, because they don't look at it. They're in Georgia, or some other state, not picking on Georgia. And I think that sometimes you can skew these conversations into rentals are bad, but I think part of the thing that's frustrating is when it becomes a corporation and just not accessible for rentals that are locally owned by people in the community are great. That's small business. That's also helping our community. But they're also invested in that neighborhood, in that area.
Right. And that's absolutely correct. And for what it's worth, like I am generally okay with rentals. That having been said, I do feel like, if all things considered equal, somebody should be, or somebody could be a renter versus an owner. You definitely want to be an owner, simply because you're more likely to have a larger stake in the community. You're able to build equity. One of the big issues folks have talked about is, inequality, and, well, hey, we have not been able to raise intergenerational wealth. Housing is pretty much the number one way people do that. If you're going to cut off that avenue, that's a major problem for the middle class. But one of the big arguments was, well, we need more affordable housing. I agree, but there are multiple ways to sort of dump supply into the system, one of which is making it harder for private equity and capital to say, hey, we're going to swallow them all up, which, of course, if you're competing with those folks, it just raises the price higher and higher and higher. Sure. By putting a lid on that to some degree, or at least making it difficult for them to buy up housing and slow them down, you should be able to, keep the price the same, or maybe even go down a little bit.
And slowing them down is key, because, like you said, usually you find out after things sell.
Yes.
And even communities, as I've chatted with people at the municipal buildings in the area, often they wish they knew. They would have helped or tried to do some kind of program through the city to try to keep that as private single-family housing, because, yes, like you said, that really helps build the community. And to be able to have that be affordable really helps a community have some stability.
Right. Absolutely. And I should probably point out, when I said Senate Bill 1079, I can't remember if I said California.
Yes.
Specifically. Yes. That way, I'm sure there's other Senate Bill 1079s floating around the country, and somebody be like, this isn't what I thought it was.
Yeah, I still look at all the bill numbers, and I appreciate that you help me define them, because I'll hear. And we'll mention this because this is related. We'll hear HB 563, and unless you've looked up what that is, then you would know that's kind of related to this discussion, and the buying up of houses in a commercial way to which takes them out of the market for people looking to be first-time buyers of houses. That's
absolutely right, and I should probably add a caveat to the housing bill that I was working on. It's not entirely the same. There were more beefed up local penalties that the locals could levy on these out-of-state owners. But California has a significantly different system than we have here in Ohio. We have home rule. In theory, local municipalities could do this on their own. So it's like, unlike 563, my thought was, let the locals do what they can do on this, and let the chips fall where they may. 563, however, does not do that. That prohibits local municipalities from banning these short-term rental agreements, which...
Or regulating them at all.
Right. This
Right.
would be, in reference to Airbnb. And, I am a staunch opponent of that bill. I've told, local elected officials who've reached out the same thing. Like, I just fundamentally have a problem with not just an assault on home rule, but, what sort of example are you setting when folks are buying up properties and then doing these short-term rentals, which are not going to really help the local community per se. I mean, you've heard obviously horror stories about something becoming a party house or God knows what, and then the absence of the local government having any control over that. That's a problem. Now, it might make sense, in a more tourist-oriented area, like if you're up there in Put in Bay or Ottawa County or something. But again, the local government could say, hey, we're perfectly fine with that. Here in Cincinnati, I don't think so. I think it's a bad idea.
Well, and the reason I bring that one up, because it's relating to the housing market that we were just talking about, taking
Right.
houses out of the market. But also, this was something just recently covered in the city of Forest Park, where they said, you know what, this is our zoning. That involves operating a business in a residential area. It's not zoned for that. If you want to do that, be zoned somewhere for hotels. Like you said, vacation areas, definitely zoned for hotels. Great places.
Yeah.
For things like that. So it's not that, no, we never want to see an Airbnb again. It was, we want to be able to decide the zoning of our neighborhoods. And what I see in HB 563 is, nope, you can't do that at the local level at all. I know you're supposed to be able to do your local zoning ideas and do your city planning, but you can't do that. We're gonna if this passes. So, what are you hearing about that in Columbus?
So obviously being in the opposite chamber there, I haven't heard much of it,
Right.
but I would be very surprised if that could gain traction in the House, let alone the Senate.
And I'll mention, the last time I looked, it was in committee in the House.
That's right.
So you haven't seen it really yet.
No.
Okay.
I've just heard it through the grapevine, and as I would, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of local elected officials
Okay.
at the municipal level have said this is, bad news on stilts. So we agree.
Well, that's I'm glad that we got to at least mention that what's happening, that you're hearing from people. The proponents of HB 563 have deep pockets, so we can see a lot of their story.
Yeah.
So I think it was important to get to hear from some different people about what they feel about it. I know that people have been going up to Columbus so that they can testify and talk to you, talk to all the other lawmen, talk to the committee involved, things like that. So.
Yeah. No, and that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think if I were in their shoes trying to make their argument, it'd be like, well, this is a private property owner. They can do this with their house, and it's like, yeah, but there are certain things that I'm sorry should be prohibited because they're, just bad news for, social cohesiveness.
This comes back to local zoning again.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I know there are a lot of folks who would say, well, this is the market. And it's like, yeah, but, there are some very egregious things that have occurred over the years, despite being, ostensibly legal. I think back to, what's that hedge fund guy's name? Martin Shkreli, who's in prison actually right now, but bought up a manufacturer's license for a particular drug that was needed for HIV/AIDS patients, and then proceeded to jack it up 56-fold for what those people had to pay, and it's just unconscionable. So is that technically the market? I guess, but it's just absolutely unconscionable.
Yeah, and this is related because this affects This is why, because these houses are getting picked up for that, this is why they're not available when people are looking for a place. Well, we have covered a lot of different things really quickly. If people have questions, is there a way they can get in touch with you?
Yes, absolutely. I would say the best way to get a hold of me is just email my office. You can call, but email's the best simply because I want, a very detailed, message that I can, refer back to. So the email is sd08@ohiosenate, all one word, .gov. And we'll get back to you very shortly, and look forward to hearing from you.
That's it. And thank you for coming to the studio. As always, I appreciate the time you take to explain to us the details of what's going on. And I look forward to the next conversation we have as we watch these things move forward or not move forward or see where they go. So thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Columbus Report on Waycross Community Media. That means you want to stay informed on what's happening in the state level of government, and we'll see you next time.